A dusty wind swept across the barren plains of Wyoming Territory in 1884, carrying with it the scent of desperation and broken dreams. Samuel McKinnon stood at the edge of his failing ranch, watching his last dozen cattle graze on what little grass remained after 3 years of drought. His weathered hands gripped the fence post so tightly his knuckles turned white, and his steel-gray eyes reflected the harsh reality he refused to accept. At 32, Sam had lost everything his father had built, everything his grandfather had died protecting from Apache raids and claim jumpers. The bank note in his shirt pocket felt heavier than the Colt .45 on his hip, and the words printed on it might as well have been his death sentence. Foreclosure. 30 days. No exceptions. The McKinnon Ranch, established 1847, would soon belong to the First National Bank of Cheyenne, and Sam would join the ranks of drifters and broken men who haunted the saloons of frontier towns. But Samuel McKinnon was not the kind of man who accepted defeat easily, and sometimes desperation makes a man do things he never thought possible. Just 5 miles south, across the rolling hills that separated poverty from prosperity, Margaret Calloway stood in the garden of her father's sprawling ranch house, completely unaware that her life was about to change forever. At 24, she was considered an old maid by frontier standards, too independent and strong-willed for most men to handle, too intelligent to pretend otherwise. Her auburn hair caught the afternoon sunlight as she bent to tend her roses, the only luxury her practical father allowed in their otherwise utilitarian world. Margaret had been raised to run a ranch, to read ledgers and negotiate with cattle buyers, to shoot straight and ride hard when necessary. What she had not been prepared for was the arrival of Samuel McKinnon at their front door 3 days later, hat in hand and desperation barely concealed behind his carefully practiced charm. Her father, Thomas Calloway, was one of the wealthiest ranchers in Wyoming Territory, a man who had turned a modest homestead into an empire through shrewd business dealings and an iron will that had never bent to man or nature. Hook 1. But Thomas Calloway had a secret that could destroy everything he had built, and Samuel McKinnon was about to become either his salvation or his downfall. When Sam approached the Calloway ranch with his proposal, he had rehearsed every word, planned every gesture, anticipated every objection. What he had not expected was the way Margaret looked at him when he explained his situation with brutal honesty, or how her green eyes seemed to see straight through to his soul. Most women would have been horrified by his boldness, shocked by his admission that he needed her father's money more than he needed a wife. But Margaret Calloway was not most women, and her response surprised everyone present, including herself. She agreed to consider his proposal not out of pity or desperation, but because she saw something in Samuel McKinnon that intrigued her, something that suggested there was more to this story than a simple business arrangement between a broke rancher and a wealthy man's daughter. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the small church in Laramie, attended by most of the prominent families in the territory and whispered about in every saloon and general store for 100 miles around. The bride wore her mother's white silk dress, altered to fit her tall, strong frame, and the groom wore his father's best suit, cleaned and pressed for the occasion. Thomas Calloway spared no expense for his daughter's wedding, though the tight set of his jaw suggested he was not entirely pleased with the arrangement. As Samuel placed the simple gold band on Margaret's finger, neither of them could have imagined the web of secrets and lies that would soon entangle them both, or the discovery that would shake the very foundations of their new marriage. The first few months passed peacefully enough, with Sam working to rebuild his ranch using his father-in-law's money and connections, while Margaret adapted to life as the wife of a man she barely knew. She moved into the modest ranch house that Sam had inherited, bringing with her a few precious possessions and a trunk full of books that raised eyebrows among the local women. But Margaret had always been different, and if her new neighbors thought it strange that she spent her evenings reading instead of mending clothes, they kept their opinions to themselves. Sam proved to be a harder worker than anyone had expected, rising before dawn to tend the cattle, mend fences, and slowly bring his land back to life. He was also, Margaret discovered, a man of surprising depth and intelligence, capable of discussing literature and philosophy as easily as cattle prices and weather patterns. Their conversations, initially awkward and formal, gradually became the highlight of both their days, and something unexpected began to grow between them. But every marriage has its secrets, and the McKinnon Ranch held more than its share of buried truths. It was on a cold October evening, while organizing Sam's father's papers in preparation for the winter, that Margaret made the first discovery that would change everything. Hidden in the bottom of an old ledger, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a faded ribbon, she found a deed to a silver mine in the Colorado mountains, dated 1863 and bearing the signature of Samuel McKinnon Sr. The deed indicated that the mine had been producing steadily for over 20 years, generating enough income to pay off any ranch debt 10 times over. Margaret stared at the document for a long time, her mind racing as she tried to understand why Sam would have claimed poverty if his family owned a profitable mine. Her first instinct was to confront him immediately, but something held her back, some instinct that told her there was more to this mystery than a simple oversight or forgotten asset. Instead, she carefully returned the deed to its hiding place and began her own investigation, writing letters to mining offices in Colorado and studying the geological surveys that her father kept in his extensive library. What she discovered over the following weeks filled her with a mixture of excitement and apprehension that she struggled to hide from her husband. Hook 2. The mine was not only real and profitable, but it was connected to a series of murders and disappearances that had terrorized the Colorado Territory for over a decade, and Samuel's father had been the prime suspect in a case that was never solved. The more Margaret learned about the Celestial Mine, as it was called in the records, the more disturbed she became by the pattern of violence that seemed to follow anyone who came too close to its secrets. 3 miners had died in what were officially termed accidents, but the report suggested that each man had discovered something about the mine's operations that someone was willing to kill to protect. A federal marshal investigating the deaths had vanished without a trace in 1875, and his replacement had been found shot to death near the mine entrance 6 months later. Samuel McKinnon Sr. had left Colorado Territory abruptly in 1876, shortly after the second marshal's murder, and had never returned to claim the mine's proceeds. Now Margaret understood why Sam had never mentioned the mine, and why his family had struggled financially despite owning such a valuable asset. The money was tainted with blood, and Sam's father had chosen poverty over the risk of claiming what was rightfully his. But that raised another question that kept Margaret awake at night, staring at the ceiling while her husband slept peacefully beside her. If Sam knew about the mine, why was he allowing them both to build their marriage on what amounted to a lie? And if he did not know, should she tell him about the discovery that could make them wealthy beyond their wildest dreams? The decision was taken out of her hands on a snowy November morning when a stranger arrived at their door, claiming to be a mining engineer from Colorado who had been searching for Samuel McKinnon Sr. for over 8 years. Margaret happened to be alone when the man knocked, Sam having ridden to town for supplies that morning, and something about the stranger's manner immediately put her on guard. He was well-dressed and polite, but his eyes were cold and calculating, and he seemed to be studying the ranch house with the intensity of a man memorizing details for future use. When Margaret explained that Sam's father had been dead for 5 years, the stranger's expression did not change, but she noticed his hand move instinctively toward the gun at his hip. The man introduced himself as Theodore Blackwood, and his story seemed reasonable enough on the surface. He claimed to represent a mining consortium that was interested in purchasing the Celestial Mine, and he had been authorized to make a substantial offer to the McKinnon family. But Margaret's instincts, honed by years of living on the frontier where the difference between truth and lies could mean the difference between life and death, told her that Theodore Blackwood was not what he appeared to be. There was something predatory in his manner, something that suggested he was more accustomed to taking what he wanted than to making fair offers for it. Margaret told him that Sam would return by evening, and invited him to stay for dinner to discuss the matter properly, all the while planning to send word to her father and to the sheriff in Laramie. But Blackwood declined the invitation with a smile that never reached his eyes, saying he would return the following day when he could speak to Sam directly. As Margaret watched him ride away, she noticed that he took the northern trail that led toward the Callaway Ranch instead of the southern route that would take him back to town, and her uneasiness grew into genuine fear. That evening, when Sam returned from town, Margaret made a decision that would test the foundations of their still fragile marriage. She told him everything, from the discovery of the mine deed to the visit from Theodore Blackwood, watching his face carefully for any sign that he had been deceiving her about his family's circumstances. What she saw there was not guilt or anger, but a bone-deep weariness that seemed to age him 10 years in the space of a few seconds. Sam sank into his chair by the fireplace and stared into the flames for a long time before he spoke. And when he finally told her his story, Margaret began to understand the true scope of the danger they were facing. Sam had known about the mine since he was 16 years old, when his father had confessed the truth about their family's wealth and the price that came with it. The Celestial Mine was cursed, his father had said, not by supernatural forces but by human greed and the willingness of certain men to kill for silver and gold. Samuel McKinnon Sr. had discovered the mine in 1863, during the height of the Colorado silver boom, but he had also discovered that it sat on land claimed by a powerful mining syndicate that operated outside the law. Rather than fight a battle he could not win, the elder McKinnon had chosen to work with the syndicate, keeping quiet about the illegal operations in exchange for a share of the profits. For over a decade, the arrangement had worked well, with McKinnon receiving enough money to keep his Wyoming ranch prosperous while turning a blind eye to the violence that kept other prospectors away from the Celestial Mine. But in 1875, when a federal marshal had begun investigating the syndicate's activities, Samuel Sr. had realized that his silence made him as guilty as the men who pulled the triggers. He had tried to withdraw from the partnership, to take his family and disappear into the vast wilderness of the American West. But the syndicate had made it clear that he knew too much to simply walk away. The elder McKinnon had spent his final years looking over his shoulder, never knowing when his former partners might decide that his silence was no longer worth the risk of keeping him alive. Now, with the appearance of Theodore Blackwood, it seemed that the past had finally caught up with the McKinnon family, and Sam was forced to confront the legacy of blood money that his father had tried so hard to escape. Margaret listened to her husband's story with a mixture of sympathy and admiration, understanding now why he had been willing to marry a stranger rather than claim the wealth that was rightfully his. But she was also a Callaway, raised by a father who had never backed down from a fight, and her response to Sam's confession surprised him as much as her acceptance of his marriage proposal had surprised her father months earlier. Instead of demanding that they flee to California or Oregon as Sam's father had planned to do, Margaret insisted that they stand and fight, using her father's connections and resources to expose the syndicate and reclaim what belonged to them. It was a dangerous plan, one that would put both their lives at risk. But Margaret had not married a broke rancher only to spend the rest of her life running from shadows. The next morning brought news that confirmed their worst fears and set in motion a chain of events that would test every assumption they had made about their marriage and their future together. A rider from the Callaway ranch arrived before dawn with word that Thomas Callaway had been shot and seriously wounded during an attempted robbery the night before. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental, and both Sam and Margaret understood immediately that Theodore Blackwood had made good on his implied threats. But when they arrived at the Callaway ranch, they discovered that Thomas was conscious and coherent despite his injuries, and what he told them about his attackers added another layer of complexity to an already dangerous situation. The men who had shot him were not random thieves or hired guns from Colorado, but local men that Thomas recognized, including the deputy sheriff from Laramie and two prominent ranchers who had been friends of the family for years. The attack had not been a robbery at all, but an interrogation, with Thomas being questioned about his daughter's marriage to Sam McKinnon and what he knew about the McKinnon family's business interests. The realization that the corruption reached into the highest levels of local law enforcement changed everything, leaving Sam and Margaret with no one to trust except each other and a handful of Thomas Callaway's most loyal ranch hands. Margaret spent that day nursing her wounded father and planning their next move, while Sam rode out to check the security of both ranches and to gather what information he could about Blackwood's activities in the area. What he discovered during his reconnaissance mission confirmed their suspicions and revealed the true scope of the conspiracy they were facing. Blackwood was not working alone, and he was not simply representing a mining consortium as he had claimed. According to the bartender at the Laramie Saloon, who remembered Blackwood from his previous visits to the territory, the man had been asking questions about the McKinnon family for over 2 years, long before Sam's marriage to Margaret had made him a more attractive target. The syndicate had been watching the McKinnons all along, waiting for the right opportunity to claim the mine and eliminate the last witness to their crimes in Colorado. Sam's marriage to the daughter of one of Wyoming's wealthiest ranchers had provided them with the leverage they needed, turning what had been a simple matter of killing a lone rancher into a complex operation that required the corruption of local officials and the intimidation of powerful families. But the syndicate had made one crucial mistake in their calculations, underestimating both Margaret's intelligence and her father's influence in the territory. Thomas Calloway had not built his empire by being naive or trusting, and his network of contacts extended far beyond Wyoming's borders, reaching into the halls of power in Washington, Denver, and San Francisco. From his sickbed, Thomas began calling in favors and sending telegrams, mobilizing resources that the syndicate had not anticipated and could not easily counter. Meanwhile, Margaret and Sam worked together to document everything they knew about the mine, the murders in Colorado, and the local connections that made Blackwood's operation possible. Their investigation revealed a web of corruption that reached deeper into the territorial government than either of them had imagined, but it also provided them with the evidence they needed to fight back. The showdown came 3 weeks later, on a bitter December morning when the first snow of winter was beginning to fall across the Wyoming plains. Blackwood returned to the McKinnon Ranch as promised, but this time he was not alone, bringing with him 6 armed men and the corrupted deputy sheriff who had participated in the attack on Thomas Calloway. They expected to find Sam and Margaret alone and defenseless, ready to sign over the mine deed in exchange for their lives. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by 20 of Thomas Calloway's ranch hands, a federal marshal who had ridden down from Montana Territory, and a territorial judge who had been investigating the syndicate's activities for months. The final confrontation was brief but decisive, ending not with a gunfight but with the reading of federal warrants that had been secretly issued weeks earlier. Blackwood and his associates were arrested on charges ranging from murder to conspiracy to defraud the federal government, while the corrupted local officials were suspended pending a full investigation of their activities. The Celestial Mine, along with its accumulated profits from over 20 years of operation, was officially restored to the McKinnon family, making Sam and Margaret one of the wealthiest couples in the Wyoming Territory overnight. But perhaps more importantly, the experience had transformed their marriage of convenience into something deeper and more meaningful than either of them had dared to hope for when they first stood together in that small church in Laramie. They had faced danger together, trusted each other with their lives and their secrets, and discovered that their partnership was stronger than the sum of its parts. The money from the mine allowed them to build something lasting and beautiful, not just for themselves but for the community that had stood by them in their hour of need. They used their wealth to establish schools and hospitals, to bring law and order to a region that had been plagued by corruption and violence, and to create opportunities for other struggling families to build better lives for themselves and their children. Years later, when the story of their unlikely romance and their battle against the mining syndicate had become legend throughout the American West, people would still marvel at how a marriage that had begun with such practical motivations had evolved into one of the great love stories of their generation. Sam and Margaret McKinnon had proven that sometimes the most unexpected partnerships can become the strongest foundations for a life well lived, and that courage and determination can triumph over even the most dangerous enemies when two people stand together against the darkness. The trial of Theodore Blackwood and his associates became one of the most sensational legal proceedings in Wyoming Territory's history, drawing newspaper reporters from as far away as Chicago and San Francisco. The evidence that Sam and Margaret had painstakingly gathered, combined with testimony from survivors of the Colorado mining operation, painted a picture of systematic murder and corruption that shocked even hardened frontier lawmen. Blackwood himself proved to be not just a hired gun, but the mastermind of an operation that had been stealing mineral rights and eliminating witnesses across 3 territories for nearly 15 years. During the proceedings, more secrets emerged about the Celestial Mine that even Sam had not known. His father had not simply been a silent partner in the syndicate's crimes, as Sam had believed, but had actually been working as an undercover agent for the federal government, gathering evidence that he planned to use to bring down the entire organization. Samuel McKinnon Sr. had died before he could complete his mission, but his detailed journals, hidden in a safety deposit box in Denver, provided the final pieces of evidence needed to convict not just Blackwood's immediate associates, but a network of corrupt officials that extended from Colorado to Washington, D.C. The revelation that his father had been a hero rather than a criminal lifted a burden from Sam's shoulders that he had carried for over a decade, and allowed him to finally make peace with the legacy he had inherited. As winter gave way to spring, Sam and Margaret began the process of transforming their unexpected wealth into something that would benefit their entire community. They established the McKinnon Foundation, dedicated to supporting education and healthcare in frontier communities, and personally funded the construction of the territory's first public library in Cheyenne. Margaret, drawing on her extensive reading and her natural gift for organization, became the library's first director, creating programs that brought books and learning opportunities to ranchers and townspeople who had never had access to formal education. Sam, meanwhile, used his knowledge of ranching and his new financial resources to help other struggling families avoid the desperation that had once driven him to consider marriage as a business transaction. He established a lending program that provided low-interest loans to young ranchers and created a cooperative system that allowed smaller operations to compete with the large cattle barons who had previously dominated the territory's economy. Their marriage, which had begun as a carefully negotiated arrangement between strangers, had evolved into a partnership that was both personally fulfilling and socially transformative. They had learned to trust each other completely, sharing not just their secrets and their fears, but their dreams for the future they wanted to build together. The arrival of their first child, a daughter they named Catherine after Sam's mother, marked the beginning of a new chapter in their lives together. Margaret proved to be as capable a mother as she was a rancher's wife, raising their daughter to be strong and independent while teaching her the value of compassion and service to others. Sam, who had once believed he was too damaged by his family's history to be a good father, discovered a gentleness and patience he had not known he possessed, spending hours teaching Catherine to ride and showing her the stars from the porch of their rebuilt ranch house. Their love story became a source of inspiration for other couples in the territory, proof that marriages based on mutual respect and shared values could grow into deep and lasting partnerships even when they did not begin with romantic passion. The McKinnon Ranch became a gathering place for their community, hosting harvest celebrations and Christmas parties that brought together people from all walks of life. Margaret's roses, which had once been her only luxury, now filled an entire garden that was open to anyone who needed a moment of beauty in their lives. The success of their partnership extended beyond their personal happiness to their business ventures, as the combination of Margaret's intellectual gifts and Sam's practical experience proved to be formidable in negotiations with cattle buyers, mining companies, and territorial officials. They expanded their operations carefully and ethically, always ensuring that their prosperity did not come at the expense of their neighbors or their principles. By 1890, 6 years after their wedding, the McKinnons had become one of the most respected families in Wyoming Territory, known not just for their wealth but for their generosity and their commitment to justice. Sam served 2 terms in the territorial legislature, where he championed laws protecting small ranchers and miners from the kind of exploitation his family had suffered. Margaret established the territory's first teacher training program, recognizing that education was the key to building a better future for the next generation. Their marriage had proven that love could grow from the most unlikely beginnings, and that 2 people who chose to stand together could overcome even the most daunting challenges. The mining syndicate that had once threatened to destroy them was now nothing but a memory, its leaders either dead or serving long prison sentences, while the Celestial Mine continued to produce wealth that the McKinnons used to build schools, hospitals, and libraries throughout the American West. As they stood together on their porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sam and Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought them from desperate strangers to devoted partners. They had faced death and betrayal, uncovered secrets that could have destroyed them, and emerged stronger for having trusted each other through the darkest moments of their lives. Their story would be told and retold for generations, becoming part of the folklore of the American frontier. But for Sam and Margaret, the greatest victory was not the wealth they had gained or the enemies they had defeated. It was the love they had discovered in each other, and the family they had built together in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. Their daughter Catherine would grow up to become a teacher and a writer, carrying on her parents' commitment to education and justice, while their son Thomas, born 2 years later, would inherit his father's love of the land and his mother's passion for reading. The McKinnon legacy would endure not just in the institutions they founded or the wealth they accumulated, but in the example they set of what 2 people could accomplish when they faced the world together with courage, integrity, and unwavering faith in each other. As the years passed and Wyoming Territory became a state, Their marriage would continue to be held up as proof that the American frontier could be a place where dreams came true and where love could triumph over even the most impossible circumstances. The broken rancher and the wealthy farmer's daughter had become something neither of them had ever expected to be, partners in every sense of the word. Their lives intertwined as completely as the roses and wild grass that grew together in Margaret's garden, creating something beautiful and lasting that would endure long after the harsh winds of the frontier had blown themselves out across the endless western sky.